Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. And longtime viewers of this show will know that one of the topics we continue to return to, because it's so important, is the topic of education and what's happening today in the world and what are the kinds of things that we can think about as we try to encourage education to be a priority here in America. And our guest tonight, Dr. Genessa Schultz, who is an expert in many areas of education, right? So, Genessa, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So just a little bit of your background. You obviously have a doctorate in education. You've been a teacher, you've been an assistant principal, you've been a principal. So this is something that seems like a real calling for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say I wanted to be in education since I was a little girl. And my path through education has been windy and not what I expected. I actually was planning to be a kindergarten teacher, but I'm nowhere near a kindergarten teacher right now. But yeah, so I've done, majority of my career has been in Chicago in urban education. I did do a couple of years in the suburban setting, but ended up coming back to Chicago.
So you mentioned urban education. Let's talk a little bit about that and what that really means and how that differs from you know, I mean, it's not that the subject matter is different, but the way you approach it is different in an urban setting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say that my time in the classroom is interesting. I can compare the suburbs to Chicago, and you're working with...
And the suburbs you're talking about, like the North Shore, I mean,
yeah,
well-to-do suburbs that are well-funded schools.
Yeah, I was in Gurnee, in the Gurnee area. And so that's where I just remember being in the classroom, and there was, well, this was in like 2007, so there was a TV and a VCR/DVD player in every classroom, carpeted, the desks were really nice. It was just, it sounds silly, but some of the amenities, they were just a little bit nicer in the suburbs because there was a little bit more money to be spent on the young people. And I remember my first experience in the classroom in the city, and it was my first paid teaching experience was in the city, and it was not what you would expect as far as in I guess growing up, I was thinking of education the way I grew up and how you know, the class sizes were about 20 kids in a class because it was a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and there was kind of a positive. It was just exciting to be in school. And so when I came into Chicago, there was still a family atmosphere in some respects, but it seemed like there was there were less resources to work with, and you could just tell the needs of the students and the families were higher than they were especially
more affluent communities.
Affluent communities, right. Correct, yeah. So
we talked a little bit before the show about some of the underlying causes, and not to get too deeply into the political side of it, but funding mechanisms for schools. So much of it is based on property taxes, on property values, and so the areas that have very high property values tend to have higher taxes, they have more revenue, and how that leads to structural inequities.
Right, right. So, and you're right, it can become very deep. So we could talk about the systemic, you know, structures that were put into place to disinvest in specific communities in Chicago. I remember going back to, I was teaching an English class in my last teaching job, and we read the book There Are No Children Here. And I remember when I read the book, I had taken the Green Line to work when I first started teaching every day. And there were just things about the city I didn't know because I was, at that time, I was not from the city. I was commuting from Lincoln Park to Garfield Park. And so I was on the Green Line. I would get off at California and I would go to my school and teach and go home. After reading the book, I realized it made me think there was no Green Line stop from Ashland all the way to California. And if you are a native of Chicago and you know Chicago's history, you would know that that's probably because Henry Horner was there.
And the housing project.
The previous, yeah, the previous housing projects. So from Ashland, which is 1600 west to California, that's a little over, it's about a mile and a half, I would say, where there's no Green Line stop. So that disinvestment, that was started way back in the 50s when they built that, and they did not consider a stop there. There's now a stop at Damon, but they're also gentrifying the area. So disinvestment goes back to way back to the 50s. And then I currently live in North Lawndale. The redlining that occurred in North Lawndale to get the more affluent families to move out of the community, and then basically taking away the jobs and taking away the all the resources and leaving the leftovers, I guess you would say, in the community. And then, you know, in 1968, the riots that took place after the assassination of King. And so just when you're basing the education of the students on the property taxes, and then you're taking away all these resources
so the property taxes will be lower.
They will have to be lower,
yeah.
right. It's equity, there's no equity. And so you're dealing with $8,000 per youth versus $25,000 per youth in different suburbs. And so how are we supposed to be providing an equitable education when we have those things?
You know, and you
place?
mentioned facilities, and I spent time with the schools in the suburbs in Proviso, where some of the schools were in serious disrepair, and one of the issues that we faced was that kids come to school and the locker rooms are trashed and they look horrible. And so what message does that send to the kids about being there? Well, the adults clearly don't care about this facility, so why should I?
Right.
And we were really faced with that and having to, go to spend lots of money, to renovate these areas. And people would say, well, gee, it's just the lockers, it's just for kids, they're just putting their stuff in there. But it's that environment that you're creating.
Yeah.
And if you create an environment that says no one cares about you as a student, then they can't help but absorb that.
Right, and they start to not care about themselves. So when we have capital come into communities that have been so disinvested, typically they're communities of color, when you have some capital improvements come in, a lot of times kids think that that's not for them. I've actually heard kids say, well, that's not for us. They're not putting that, Mariano's or the Whole Foods, that's not for us.
That's for the gentrification that'll
That
come.
is for the gentrification. Right. And so it's complicated, and you just start peeling back all these layers of the onion, and okay, there's low property taxes because of this, and then trying to get people to move into the community, but what are we doing with the people that get displaced? And there's so many effects to it, and it all comes back to educating our kids, and they're the ones that end up paying for that.
So you talked about the differences in educating in this kind of urban environment. And so going back to your days as a teacher, what kinds of things did you have to do to approach the, just class plans or even just handling the students on an individual basis that would be different from a more affluent community?
And so trauma informed is the new buzzword right now, and it shouldn't be the new buzzword. I think that every person who works with young people, if you are seasoned and really meant to work with young people, I think you're naturally trauma informed. And
what does that mean, trauma informed?
So a trauma informed approach, a lot of times when a young person will take tardiness, for example, they come into school late. They're like, oh, you're late again, versus, hey, how are you today? Is everything okay? It's two different approaches. You're still going to find out why they're late. You're still letting them know, like, I see that you're here late, but instead of saying, oh, you're late again, you're trying to find out, well, why are you late?
In a sense that if you tell me why you're late, maybe there's something I can do to help you with this, right? As opposed to, gee, you messed up again.
Exactly. So, and I will say in the current work that I'm doing with Alternative Schools Network, we provide mentoring and the wraparound and supportive services for the young people. And so part of that is we provide trauma-informed trainings for the teachers to make sure that the schools are trauma-informed. But we also we also provide any young person that comes into a program of ours gets a mentor. And that mentor, go ahead.
Well, just let me back up for a second, because you
Sure.
mentioned alternative schools, and I want to go into what that is. I mean, it's not, many people I think would think, oh gee, you're talking about the charter school system, but that's really not what we're talking about here.
No. Alternative schools has various meanings, and it depends on what part of the city and what part of the, honestly, what part of the country you're in. So I remember when I was in high school, there was a school literally called Spash Alternative, and that school was for kids who dropped out and went to this school. And at that time, they didn't necessarily need to have an IEP or be labeled with some sort of special need.
IEP, you and I know what that is.
Yes. Oh, an individualized education plan.
Which is something that gets developed for students who are struggling.
Yes, it was struggling, whether they have a behavior issue, a learning concern, if they have significant learning concerns, honestly, even if they're blind or deaf, those are all things that constitute being able to have an IEP. And it means that the school recognizes that you're going to need some additional support, and it's a legal contract with that young person and their family saying we have to provide these supports to make sure you have a fair education.
So in the alternative schools we're talking about here in this area, a student would need one of these IEPs in order to be enrollable in these alternative
Some
schools?
schools are like that. The organization I work with, Alternatives, we do not require the kids to have an IEP. Actually, the population that we serve are young people who have dropped out and are choosing to come back to school. And so some of them, I would say many of them have some sort of learning, I'm not going to say delay, there's just some sort of struggle when...
Some obstacle that they face
yes,
in
to
trying
typical
to learn.
school, right. So if they, the young people I worked with were all incredibly intelligent, and unfortunately they went through a school system that was not made for every young person on this earth, and so it didn't work for them, and for whatever reason they needed to stop going to school, and that reason varies. We get back to the trauma-informed. Maybe they stopped going to school because they had a sick parent to take care of. Maybe they stopped going to school because the school stopped caring. Maybe they stopped going to school because they needed to get a job, or they needed to, whatever reason. Some kids stop going to school because they have housing issues. You know, they're couch surfing, homeless,
right.
yeah. So whatever those reasons, the kids end up stopping coming to school. We find those kids. We enroll them.
How do you find them? How do you come across them?
Various ways. So when talking about Alternative Schools Network, our mentors go out, literally they will sometimes be out recruiting kids at block parties, at different events that the aldermen will have, or different community events. A lot of our young people, if their parents went to our school, they'll say, you know what, maybe you need to come to CCA or Westtown or whatever the school is that they went to. Because they know that they need a smaller setting. And they also know that when they come to one of our schools, their mentor is going to be calling them. Oftentimes when you're in a large school setting, when there's 2,000 kids in the building, your teachers and counselors can't call every kid and say, why aren't you here today?
Sure, and it's hard to have that kind of one-to-one relationship between a teacher and a student, or a counselor and a student.
Right. And so they come to us, they get a mentor. We have 200 kids, approximately between 150 and 225 in all of our schools. Everyone knows everyone. If you miss a day, we know, and we start calling. And it kind of brings me back to trauma-informed. So we know that if Chris comes to school every day on time, but then all of a sudden Chris starts coming at 10 o'clock or Chris starts coming at 11, we need to sit down and say, what's going on? How can we help you?
Because something has changed.
Because something has changed, and we can tell. We have a small enough setting to be able to tell. And so
in a case like that, what resources do you have? So let's say, take this example of Chris, whoever Chris might be, who could be a boy or a girl.
Right.
So Chris has a problem because Chris's parents have split up, and there's financial problems, and there's conflict. How would your organization be able to help with that? Because that's really outside of school. It's a it's a family issue.
Right.
So how would you be able to step in and be helpful?
So multiple ways. We would need to determine how that issue is affecting Chris. If that issue is causing him to not have stable housing, we have partnerships, and we can reach out to different organizations that would help with housing. If he or she isn't able to get to or from school, most of our programs provide transportation, so we can give him a bus card. Some of our programs even provide monies for groceries, monies for childcare if our student has children of their own. So we have these programs put into place. So whatever barrier is there, we can work around it, because our goal is to get the kids into the high school, coming as often every day, and graduated, and then on to post-secondary or the military or a job, just getting them prepared for life beyond high school.
And speaking of that, do you do follow-up? So once the kids do graduate, do you follow up to find out where they are a year or 2 years or 3 years out?
So that varies school to school. We do have a large program right now within our schools with the Department of Children and Family Services, and they are wanting us to do some follow-up care for a year, because once a student gets a high school diploma, that used to be enough, but now we know that we need to follow up for a year with the kids, at least a year, probably 5 or 10 years.
But that's a different dynamic.
That is a different dynamic
Right.
altogether, yes. And I will say, even without that funding, so to speak, to follow up, our teachers and our staff maintain such close relationships with the kids. And even prior to my experience in Alternative Schools Network and Alternative Schools in general, I still keep in touch with kids from my first 5 years of teaching, and that's 20 years ago. Robert and Kiera.
Well, my mother, who was a teacher all of her career, would run into students, and she, even after she was retired, so this would be 40 years later.
Yes.
And these are now adults who would
Yes.
stop her in the grocery store.
Yes.
And remember and these were elementary students when she had them.
Yes.
So yeah, those kinds of bonds, they do tend
Yes.
to last, right? If
Yes.
you've made that connection properly,
Yes.
you're remembered.
Yeah, if I started naming all the kids that I still contact with, they'd get mad because I would forget one, I'm sure. Yeah, so I would say that within the smaller school settings that we're able to just provide that TLC and that care, and that actually the 2 young people who are very real that I just mentioned, that was a regular public school, but it was a small school, less than I think there was about 200 kids in
the whole
that
school?
schools. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a small grammar school in Chicago. So yeah.
So a quick anecdote. I was years ago. I was taking my mother to a concert at the Symphony Center.
Okay.
And as we were coming in, getting seated, the head of security approached me and pulled me aside. And I'm like, what's going on? And he looked. He said, "Is that Mrs. McDermott?" I was like, "Yes." Well, of course, he was a student.
Yes.
And so he wanted to go over and say hello.
That is great.
And he's a guy in his 50s probably at the time, but he still remembered and wanted to reconnect.
Yeah.
So I think the message from that is the connection that needs to be made, and how it's very easy to think of education in the abstract, and particularly like at a legislative level, or even as I was on the school board, you don't necessarily have that personal contact with the students, but that really is where, to use a bad cliche, where the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We definitely have to have those relationships in order to get through to any young person, but in the urban setting, it's so much more important. Mentoring. There's so much research on mentoring right now, and I would say every grant maker is trying to incorporate mentoring as a component of their program right now. What are you doing to mentor? How does mentoring play a key role? We've been mentoring kids for 45 years with the programs at ASN, and so, to us, it's second nature. And to people who are working in small schools and especially in urban settings, is also often second nature. And the anecdotes of running into students 30 years later are what keep teachers and school personnel going. You know, really, it is.
So how do we as citizens take these kinds of discussion, these kinds of lessons, and work with our legislatures or work with our local school boards or school districts in order to try to move this kind of thinking forward? Because I don't know that this is really prevalent enough in our thinking about education.
Yeah, I think that many people think they're experts on education because we all went to school.
Right.
And just to remember that when we're dealing with human beings, it's not a product off the assembly line. Every young person has their own story, has their own barrier, and and every young person has a barrier that they're trying to overcome. And so when we're in the field of education and trying to help the kids and work with them, allow us to do what we do, I guess that's a lot of trust. But as far as citizens, support the teachers, support the schools. You know, everyone wants to say, oh, it's the school's fault. Kids only spend 30% of their lives between 5 and 18 in a school. The other 70%, and that takes away sleeping.
Yes, right, right.
That doesn't even count sleeping. So the other 70% is spent elsewhere. So if you are a community member and if you see
Or find out why.
Or find out why, yeah, find out why. Help them get into a school. You know, that's that would be a huge help, is to help the kids get into school. And then play an active role, ask questions. You know, how can I help you get into school? What's going on? And then if you know teachers, everyone wants to be the expert about education, but you're not. Like, if you want to help, advocate and realize that education is huge, and if we don't have the resources, if we don't have what we need to provide an equitable education for the kids, it's only going to affect all of us in our future. We need to have the resources in the classroom and in the schools, so that the kids can succeed.
I'm sure you've heard the concept of the school to prison pipeline, where we do, as a society, really pay that price if the kids aren't being paid attention to, if they're allowed to just drift off or be dropped out. And then, as a society, we pay that price, because if they don't have an education, then they're going to have trouble getting a job. They may well turn to crime or vagrancy or just end up homeless. And we all have to, and I mean, in terms of real dollars, we pay for that. Right, not just in terms of moral cohesion or societal, peace. So those are the kinds of things I think that people tend to forget when you're thinking about education as a social and public good, that we all benefit when everybody's educated. Right.
Right. And I also think just having the silos are huge right now, right? Especially in communities of color, or communities where there's a high crime rate. And so everyone wants to be the hero in fixing it, right? So instead of trying to take credit for fixing the issue, we need to work together. And so I say that it's silos because I have some, when I was assistant principal, we had a young person on home monitoring. And in order for that person to get movement to come to school, we have to send the people, the sheriff's department, the schedule, the letter, in order for them to be able to go to and from school. And so we did that. And so in order to get additional movement, so if there's a school function, if the young person wants to play basketball or all of these things, we have to go through more hoops. I had a young person who participated in an OSHA training on Monday and Tuesday. And in order to get this young person movement, we had to make like days of phone calls to the sheriff's department. And this is to get this young person an OSHA 10 certification so they can move beyond and get a job, It shouldn't be that difficult.
Yeah, so it seems like there are these structural impediments to helping these kids to be successful.
Yes, yes, definitely. And so we ended up getting the movement for him. He ended up passing his OSHA 10. So it was a 2-day training, Monday and Tuesday. We'll see how this helps him get a job. But like, these are important things. We can't expect the kids to change their lives if we're putting up barriers in order for them when they're, when they're trying to make these changes.
Well, and I also think that, we talked earlier before the show about getting kids to believe in themselves, and how so much of the feedback it can be negative, and it just reinforces the feeling that, well, I'm worthless, or I have no business being in school, and I'm never going to succeed anyway, so why try? And so this kind of, the things we're talking about, what was it, trauma-aware?
Trauma-informed.
Trauma-informed, yes. These kinds of things are all seem to be geared toward this, changing our focus to get the kids to believe in themselves.
Yeah. An asset-based approach to education. So what can you show me? What can you do? We talked before, I said in the typical education system, there's 60 ways to fail, and there's, 40 ways to succeed, right? So, and that's based on getting a 60% or lower, getting your F or whatever. But we, in that, when you have take one test and you bomb it, your grade can go from an A to a C or a D. Does that mean you don't know anything? No, it means you had a bad day. Like, you had a bad day. We all have bad days, and I hope I'm not judged for my one bad day versus all the good ones. So we really pushed specifically when we do leadership conferences. I know Martrice Manuel, our associate director, and Jack Weiss, the executive director, are really pushing for our schools to take an asset-based approach.
And what is that, asset-based?
Asset-based meaning we look at the whole child and what is it that you're really, really good at, and we'll start there. Rather than coming in and I see you're reading at the 3rd grade level, or I see you're reading, like that's going to be really hard. I also see that you are extremely verbal and you are able to, so many of my kids were so good at like comebacks, like, oh, you are so smart, just if you could write it down for me. But taking that approach, like, what are you really good at, and let's go from there.
Well, I think it's interesting recognizing that, a really quick comeback takes a sharp mind.
It totally does.
Right?
Yeah.
And so to recognize that when maybe they're bad at algebra,
right,
but they know this, and so there's clearly some, as you said, assets. There are assets in that brain that need to be brought forward, right? So is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. Self-efficacy is when I did my dissertation research, that was like the #1 reason that kids do high-risk things. If they have low self-efficacy, if they don't see themselves, meaning...
Is that like self-esteem? Is
yeah,
that similar?
More of like, what can you see yourself doing in 5 years? So if you see yourself being able to contribute, you're probably going to think a little bit more. I mean, obviously brain development plays into it as well. Sure. But if we're able to help the kids have a high level of self-efficacy, like you do matter, you're an important person in this world, they're going to produce for you. They're going to excel. They're going to do great things, and that's that asset-based approach.
Well, I know you'll find this astonishing, but we're out of time. Right. So it's been a great pleasure having you
here,
Genessa.
Thank you.
This is one of my favorite subjects, so I hope you'll come back and join us again and talk about all the progress you've made since the last time we talked. Right?
Hopefully you'll have me. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so thank you again. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.